Hello, it's me, Ursula. I'm trying my hardest. I make comics, I do the art, my hubby Bones does the writing, and today I'm here to talk about character design mistakes you should be avoiding. Now, this is all within comics. Character design is like a big topic, and it covers several mediums, but I'm specifically talking about designing for comics, which has a certain set of, I guess there's no hard and fast rules, honestly. I think that's one of my big points with like character design is it's very subjective, but there are some things I can advise you to make the design and art process easier while making comics. So here we go. Yeah, comic design is very subjective. It depends on what you want for your story, and it depends on like the purpose of your story as well. So like a character that's designed for like a cute little slice of life that's very like relaxed and cozy requires very different design compared to like maybe a more heavy narrative, gritty epic fantasy story. Like the design choices are very different. It depends on your style, it depends on what you like, what you're trying to market, but it's very subjective. So I guess if I say anything here and you're like, that doesn't work for me, don't let me discourage you. It's all what you want to do, right? So yeah, take it or leave it. It's up to you, I guess. Okay. So, mistake number 1 to avoid when you're designing your characters for your comic is making them too generic, making the design boring. And I think everyone wants to avoid this issue. I mean, if you're looking at videos on like how to design characters, this may be a problem you're facing where you feel like your designs are boring. And this is something I have struggled with in my early years with designing characters. You know, they all had the same hairstyle. They all wore jeans and t-shirts. And like, we can all think of stories with characters that have very like generic, boring characters. Like, for example, people make fun of like the generic anime boy protagonist. Think like, I mean, Shinji Ikari from like Evangelion is kind of iconic now, but like, you know, boring boy protagonist who doesn't really stand out compared to like the anime girlies around him. Now, there is a purpose to a character like that, I will say, so you can use it if you want to. The reason for this, people make a kind of generic main character, is so that the viewer can then place themselves as that character. So this could happen in, say, like a visual novel, which I guess isn't a comic, but there are adjacent things where, you know, if you're playing a visual novel, you probably will want to pretend to be the main character. Well, I guess that's one style of visual novel. I'm getting off track here. I'll stick to comics. So in your comic, you know, if you want your character to be very relatable, you may have like a generic girl, a generic boy, maybe a generic non-binary, so that your reader can kind of put themselves in the place of the main character. That is a choice you can make. So that is when you can make your character generic and boring. It's also good to have characters that are unique looking and stand out, because it will make them more memorable when people read your comic. And that's kind of what we want, right? So how do you fix this? How do you stop your characters from being boring, generic, too plain? I think what's really helpful is understanding the personality of your character. That's typically where I start when I'm designing a character. I'll write down kind of like who they are as a person, what are things they like, what is the setting they're in. So for example, if I have a character who's like super bubbly and friendly, I'm gonna draw them differently than I would draw a character who's maybe very like moody and somber and dour. And you can use your design to express their personality. So, and you can do this in kind of like a stereotypical way, which is usually how I start, but then I'll kind of refine it down to something more unique. But you know, say the bubbly character, you're like, well, I'm going to use really like sunny, bright colors. I'm going to use really bubbly shapes. I'm going to make them look very, you know, I'm going to use like starburst designs in their shapes so that they look like a bright sun. Whereas like my dour character, I'm going to make them look kind of like a willow, where they're very like bent over and like, you know, their long sweeping hairs in their face. And every feature of theirs is kind of like down, like slanted down, like gravity just, pushes their eyelids down kind of thing because they're so sad. And then you can also bring in like, well, what are their interests? What are their hobbies? What's their job? Are they a student? A student looks very different than, say, like a lawyer character or a sword fighter character or a high priestess character. And you can pull from other designs that you find inspiring. Now, don't steal these whole cloth. Obviously, you can make homages to characters that you like. You could say, like, I really want to make a character that looks like Sailor Moon in kind of an homage-y way. Or it's like, I'm going to use that kind of, like, Sailor Scout outfit, but change it so that it's more like punk rock girly instead of, like, a cute 90s anime girly. And yeah, genre also comes into it. And I think understanding like what to pull from each genre is kind of like understanding the genre you're writing. So if you're like, I'm writing a cyberpunk story, you can look into cyberpunk stories that exist and kind of break down what are the visual motifs that like work here. Is it like glowing circuits on like prosthetics that people have? Is it like kind of noir inspired trench coats and stuff? There's genre trappings, visual trappings you can pull from for like fantasy, sci-fi, slice of life, shoujo manga, shonen manga, horror, action. There's motifs that you'll see in these genres and you can pull from them. And I would say, like, again, don't take things whole cloth, don't steal things. You want to change it and put your own spin on it by kind of understanding what goes into these genres, what appeals to you, and tailoring it to the specific character by understanding like their personality, their purpose in the story. I think that will make your characters more unique. And I would say when you're starting with it, push your character to like the weirdest design you can think of, like the most unique, maybe even make it overcomplicated, and then pull back. And that kind of brings me on to the next mistake, that even though I'm recommending you do this, there's the second step where you pull back. The second mistake I see people make is making designs too complex. Now, the reason that having a design that's like too complex is sometimes a bad thing in comics, while it does make your characters look unique, it can be hard to replicate. It can be hard to draw over and over again. In comics, you're going to be drawing the same thing over and over again, typically by yourself. Maybe with one or two creative partners, but typically by yourself, and it takes a long time to draw. So with comics, I do tend to tell people to create simpler designs because it is more replicable. Now, again, if you're like, that doesn't work for my story, I like complex designs, keep it, do it. But that is my warning. It is time consuming. You can make mistakes where things kind of go off model if things are too complex. You can make things a little more complex than you can with, say, animation, just because with animation you do need, like, things tend to be simple because it's easier to, there's lots of reasons, but to, like, keep track of, like, shape and keep it consistent, as well as, like, different elements of the design, where, like, more simple makes it, again, easy to replicate and easy to animate. With comics, you do, because you're working with static images, you can get a little more complex, but simple is easier on you. So what do you do if you have your design that is just like too much? You maybe have too many accessories, too many little details. It could be that you're using like shapes that are really hard to replicate, like they're just very complex shapes that are hard to draw in like a turnaround. That is something when you're designing your characters for a comic, even if you're using static images, you do need to understand how they look at every angle because you're likely going to be drawing them at every angle. So if things are too complex, I would just say pull back. I would say go too far in the other direction. Let's say the issue is like they have a ton of accessories. Let's use like the Square Enix problem where they have like laces and zippers and buckles and you know what I'm talking about? That stereotypical design thing. Pull back a bunch. It's like, okay, I want a character that does have lots of zippers and buckles on their design. How much of this can I pull back while still reading as a character that has buckles and zippers in their design? Where you can make a character like look complex, without being complex. You can really simplify your shapes, meaning like take away details. So for a zipper, instead of drawing like all the tiny little teeth of the zipper, you can draw just like little squares. You can draw a rectangle and just draw some little lines through it and the little zipper tag at the end. Simplify as far as you can while still making it legible as that thing. And a way to check that you've like pulled things back enough is to get feedback on it. This is the same I should have said for like if your characters may be boring, get feedback on it. Sometimes we stare at our characters for so long that like it all kind of runs together and is meaningless. Like when you say the same word over and over again, it loses meaning. Show it to people, get feedback. An exercise I really like is like a vibe check. I do it with our critique streams where our Patreon and YouTube supporters will submit their character designs. I'll usually do like a vibe check on them. I'll try to read the character's personality to the creator to see like, and then if I get it right, I mean, obviously like get feedback from multiple people, but you know, if I get the vibes correct, it's like, okay, you've designed a character that reads as this personality to me. Check with multiple people, because if you get the same kind of read back from multiple people, that usually means that's like what your character is giving. And sometimes you get like a really weird reading. Sometimes people are just like, they say something totally out of the blue, just that comes from like their own bias. But if you hear the same thing multiple times, that's usually a sign that like this is the vibe your character is giving off. So yeah, so simplify, and get feedback. And hopefully your characters won't be so complex. Mistake number 3 is same face and body syndrome. I used to hear same face syndrome all the time. And same face syndrome is when it was typically like critique, feedback, sometimes insult given to like creators with like a very anime style, where they'd have basically just like a template for how they draw a face, and then they'd put different like accessories on the face, so like different hairstyles, different eye colors, skin tones, but at the core the face would be like the exact same for every character. And the same goes for like body types. You'd have one body type and then you just change like the clothing, accessories, coloring of your characters. I would say I don't think it's a bad thing to have kind of like it is and it isn't. I think it depends on the project. You can have characters where like they all use the same body type, same face kind of template. And I think that's fine. It's your project. You can do what you like. Maybe that's just how your style works for you. I think it's good to diversify these things with different face shapes, different body types. I think it just has a net positive on like your story feeling real. If you have characters of multiple, say like, I'm mostly thinking like body type, because I think the body type of the character affects like the facial shapes as well. And this is something I've done in the past. In the past, a lot of my characters were very thin. And even though I am a fat person, I wouldn't draw fat characters very often. And I really had to push myself to not just make all of my characters skinny. But this can include like characters being different heights, different like levels of muscle, having like a really like low muscle tone character versus like a very muscled character. Some characters can be like very broad shouldered, broad hips. Yeah, just different body shapes. And I think when you first start doing this, like diversifying the faces and bodies of your characters, if you do like when I started, stick to like one kind of like shape for your characters, it feels really weird. It feels unnatural. It doesn't feel like your style when you start. So I would say push it as far as you can, make some very different looking characters from your typical, and then keep practicing at it. Find ways to bring it back into your style. Is it like, okay, the reason this doesn't look like my style is that I've defined my style using only straight lines. I don't know. I can't think of something specific. Or like, I only use these very like big anime eyes. And so trying to draw smaller eyes feels weird in my style. Try to find other ways to like bring it back into your style where it's like, okay, I'm only using rectangular shapes. Maybe I'll try adding some curved lines here and there. And the thing that actually makes it my style is I really like line weight variation. I really like a very like sleek but varied line. Yeah, and just keep practicing. It'll become more natural and fit more in your style the more you practice. And it is helpful to look at how other people stylize different body shapes as well. I found it really helpful to look at other creators who draw, say, like fat characters, who draw muscled characters, to see how they simplify those shapes and take that as inspiration. And I think it'll just have like a net positive on your work. I think it'll just make it more realistic because people do exist with different body shapes, different face types. So your setting will feel more real. And I think it helps express different characters really well. Some characters are expressed really well by their body shape. And you can also play around with that. You may have a character where there's a stereotype, you know, they're a big muscly dude and everyone thinks they're really tough and scary, and inside they're a big softie, you know? We all love that trope. And being able to draw that can really kind of bring that out in your characters. Mistake number 4. Your characters don't work together in your story. Don't get me wrong, there are some stories where it makes sense that your characters don't work together holistically. So for example, if you have a story where, say, you have a bunch of characters coming in from different worlds, maybe you have one character from like a sci-fi world, so they look really sci-fi. You have a character from like a fantasy world, so they look like a little elf from Zelda, you know? I guess a Hylian. And then you have someone from the modern world, and then you have someone from like the 1950s our world, you know? Like there's reasons you can have characters that look like they're from very different genres, from very different settings. But typically, if you have just your one setting, whether it's like a modern, contemporary setting, whether it's historical, your own fantasy or sci-fi world, you would like to take all your characters in your story, put them in a line. They should all feel like they're from the same story. Now, reasons why they might feel incongruent, like even though it's all from one setting, they don't feel like they work together. It could be you're using very different shapes and motifs, very different colors. If your color palette is like all over the place, it can feel weird. Now, I don't mean necessarily like, you can use kind of like every color of the rainbow in a story. Again, I think that just creates like very diverse, recognizable characters. But sometimes you need to like give them all like a color treatment. So for example, maybe you have characters where like their colors are really bright and vibrant, and you have some that are really dull and desaturated. Sometimes you need to like bring them together, if that makes sense. Like kind of like, you don't want them all to be like mid-tone. Like that's too far, but you can kind of like pull them back together on like the vibrancy scale, where the bright colors are maybe toned down a little bit so they're more equal to these dull colors. And maybe you brighten up the dull colors a little bit so they're more equal to these bright colors. And this can also be like kind of tinting your colors. So you still have like, you know, RGBIV, the rainbow colors, but maybe you pull like a little bit of blue into all of them so they all fit this kind of like cool somber tone. Or, you know, you maybe sepia tint them a little bit so they feel kind of like antique and vintage, you know, whatever suits your story. And that can be some way to bring colors together. And it's the same with shapes. So maybe you have some characters that are super like spiky and pointy, you have some that are very like rounded off and circular, and maybe they don't feel congruent. You know, maybe you need to like sand down the edges on the pointy characters and maybe sharpen up the round characters a little bit. And another important thing to look at, like before you go through and maybe like align everything, it can also help to like sit down and look at all your characters in a group and kind of realize what their purpose in the story is. So you may have a character where the point of them is to stand out. I don't know, off the top of my head, you have this group of characters who maybe all look very similar, and then you have someone who breaks away and becomes a villain. So maybe they have a bit of a unique look to kind of signify this person is like an outsider, or they're going to leave the group. That might be a little bit too... that might give your story away a little too much. That might be too bold. But there are things you can do like that, where you can really make them stand out because of their purpose in the story. And another way to do this for like groups of characters is to understand, I kind of like to make teams for characters. So like I'll take say like my group of main characters, like my heroes for the story, and I might, even though they each have their own kind of like unique color palette or shape story, I'll usually take them and kind of align them together a little bit. So like, you know, maybe all my heroes, they have a little bit of yellow and blue in their designs. Even if their main color is maybe something else, they still have this like yellow and blue piece that brings them all together. Maybe all their shapes are rounded off a little bit so they feel more kind of friendly and approachable. And then I'll take my villain team and maybe I'll put some like, I don't know, green and purple or something. Those are like villainous colors, right? Through their design. And for each of these teams, you know, I could put a shape kind of through line where it's like all my heroes have this kind of like circle motif. And maybe all my villains have this like star motif kind of through their shapes. And you can make it as subtle or as like apparent as you want. If you're looking for a good example of like how a team can really be brought together, an example Bones and I really pulled from was the protagonists of Gurren Lagann, which is a great anime. I'm sure everyone's heard of it. But the hero team in that, their colors are very aligned, even if each character kind of has like their own main color. But they all have this like very red, blue, yellow motif, and their shapes are very similar. They have like a flame kind of motif going through. Just a really good use of like aligning this group of characters through color and shape. And that can really help, hopefully, bring all your characters together so they feel like they're from the same setting. Honestly, lining up your characters, doing like just a group of all of them really helps. You can see which characters stick out really easily. And again, get feedback on things. Sometimes you can't see it because you've been staring at it for so long and someone else will point out the issue. Now mistake number 5, which I think is the final mistake of this video. And that is your characters don't fit the setting. Now, I think a lot of what I said in the last point covers this too, but it's more between character and setting rather than like all the characters together as a whole. So you can discover this when, say, you draw out a setting and you stick your characters in it and they just don't work. They just don't fit into it. Again, there are intentional times you can do this. You can have a modern character who's dropped into a fantasy world, like an isekai story, where they totally stand out because they are not from this world. But obviously, if you have all your fantasy characters in your fantasy setting, you know, they're all from this town, they're all from this city, you probably want them to fit into it a little bit. And sometimes, I think the reason characters stand out against a setting, a lot of it comes to, I think, color grading, as well as, like, again, shapes and visual motifs. I think the color grading comes out a lot. Because I think, honestly, when people design their settings, they are thinking, like, this is, like, I mean, I guess you should be when you're designing a setting, is thinking, like, you know, what's the culture that, you know, if you're designing a city, what's the culture that has created this city? Is this a city that has, like an authoritarian kind of figure in it who decides how everything looks? Or is it a city where there's, like, lots of groups of, like, different people who have immigrated here who, you know, it's all mixed together, or there's different pockets of these different people, and how would they kind of like decorate and create this space? You know, what's the economic status of the place? You know, something that is maybe attacked by that devil called poverty, you know, looks different than like the mansion of like a duke who is very affluent. That can change it a lot. Obviously, there's motifs between genres. Something that's fantasy might look a bit more historical. Something that is sci-fi might look very like sleek, modern, futuristic. And sometimes you're drawing from real life. Maybe you're drawing a street in Toronto, you know? And then other things to think about are like climate. You know, is this like a very hot location? Is it a very like dry, deserty location? Is it tropical? Is it cold and near the tundra? Is it the prairies? Is it by the sea? There's lots of things to consider there. Climate-wise, that can also affect how it looks and feels. There's like magic effects. Like, is there like a curse on this place that can visually look very different than like, oh, this place has been blessed by the goddess or whatever. Now, obviously, you've thought all this out when you're world building and designing and stuff. But how do you make your character kind of blend into these wonderful settings? And sometimes it can be that motif, where sometimes if you have a character who is living in a farm, who's living on a farm, it's very like cottagecore, very rustic, you can design them to kind of fit in. Maybe they have these kind of like thread worn shirts and little flower embroidery on their clothing. Maybe their design is a little bit more rustic than like the sleek city boy, you know? So that can be helpful because your character can fit the setting they're from, kind of shape and motif wise. But if you take the sleek city boy and put him on the cottagecore farm, you still want him to fit in. And that can be, I think the first thing I would look at is like color grading. So maybe when you designed him, he's wearing like these like navy blues, these very dark, sleek colors, like bright whites as like contrast. And then when he's on this farm that's all like yellows and pinks and oranges and stuff, and greens, he stands out because he's these very dark colors compared to these like pastel pinky colors that are part of this setting. You need to like change the colors to fit the setting. So like you can, it's difficult. It takes a lot of practice, but color relativity just means that the same color looks different depending on like the lighting it's in by the other colors it's surrounded by, but you need to account for like color relativity. So if you have say he's wearing like a navy jacket, the city boy, you can take that navy, that really dark rich navy, and maybe desaturate it, kind of pull it back into like a more green color, where maybe it turns like a little bit more gray looking, a little desaturated when he's like under the direct warm sunlight. And it depends on what the setting is, what the colors are. So I can't give you like a specific formula to make it work. Sometimes it just takes playing around with. But if you're looking at your character in a setting and you're like, they stick out, they look weird, something is off, play around with the colors. Like grab your color, open your hue and saturation filter, and just mess around with those sliders a little bit until they fit in. And again, getting feedback on this, showing it to people and saying like, does that read as navy even though I've like changed the color? Maybe don't say that. That can be kind of leading. But you can say like, what color do you think his jacket is? And they can say. And it does help to then take these characters and put them in different settings, because the navy shirt, the navy jacket will look different than, you know, in direct sunlight versus at night versus, I don't know, intense sunset light, you know? Yep, so play around with colors. You can bring the shapes in. And again, you can play around with like making your character stand out because they don't fit into this setting, like the city boy who sticks out like a sore thumb because he's on the cottagecore farm. Or you can play around with like really making the other character, his cottagecore boyfriend, really fit in with the farm using motifs and colors. So there you go. That's my big ramble. I wrote down like a bonus mistake apparently in this old script, saying like the last mistake you can make is making things impossible to replicate, but I think I already covered that. With your comic, you're going to be drawing the same thing over and over again. You want it to be very easy to draw over and over again. You want things to be easy to stay on model. And I think my best piece of advice for that is to make things easy shapes. Stick to like squares, circles, triangles. Now obviously, because like people and anthro characters and even like robotic characters and stuff, like they're, you know, we're more complex than just simple shapes, and it might not fit your style, but the more you can simplify things and bring them closer to those simple shapes, the easier they are to replicate. So try to pull it there as far as you can while keeping it within your style, and break things down, even if it's like multiple simple shapes that create like a larger, more complex shape. If you can break down those shapes within, it can make it easy to replicate. Because if you know, like with this face, I have to draw, you know, these shapes to make it work, then you're good. And you can draw them at any angle because you know what shapes are inside that face. And that's it. That's all I got. Please let me know if you have any questions about character design. I hope this all made sense. Let me know what questions you have about comics, and I will happily answer them. Until tomorrow. Goodbye.